Paul Stovell joins us today, the founder and CEO of Octopus Deploy.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. You can go to www.azuredevops.show to see all the different shows and topics that we have. And we have really exciting lineups coming up. But our guest today is Paul Stovell, the founder and CEO of Octopus Deploy. Paul is an expert on all things automated deployments and cloud operations. Paul, hello. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me.
Man, we've got a lot to talk about today, and so much is going on in the industry and so much to get to. But for those who might not have heard you speak before, how did you get into this business, and what's your career journey been like?
Yeah, sure. So Octopus started in 2011 or so. So we've been doing this for quite a while now. Before that, I worked as a consultant. So I spent about 5 years at a company, not too dissimilar to ClearMeasure. And I'd go into projects where the team would be struggling with something. So maybe it was a project that had been running for a really long time that wasn't delivering. And my job would be to try and help get things back on track. And, as every developer does, I kind of think of it a little bit like a builder. You turn up on site and your job is to build something, but there's a lot of scaffolding and other stuff that's not really part of your job so much, but it's just something that has to be done for a project. And so, for me, that was like starting off with source control. Is there source control in place? And often back in sort of the mid-2000s, there wasn't. So you would introduce a source control system, and that might take a day to set up, plus a bit of time to train people. And then you would look at how the builds happen, and you would hear things like, it works on my machine, but it doesn't work in production. Or another developer would get the code from source control, but wouldn't be able to make it compile, but it would compile on someone else's machine. So we'd set up a build server. And at the time, like for source control, there was Subversion, CVS, TFS was kind of had come out. And then there were build servers, like starting off with Draco and Cruise Control and Team City, and then obviously Team Foundation Server 2. And then you would spend sort of 4-5 weeks trying to figure out how to deploy what you had built into production. And production, the cloud wasn't so much of a thing, so it was data centers and FTP and remote desktop and managed data centers and all this sort of thing. And so Octopus was kind of born from that. I wanted to be able to go into a project. If they didn't have source control, put it in. If they didn't have build, put it in. We don't do those things, but there are great solutions out there for it already. But deployments wasn't a solved problem, and so we set out to solve that. So yeah, that was 2011. Since then, we've just keep chugging along, trying to do automated deployments really, really well. That's what we focus on.
Yeah, you just kind of done the rundown in the last couple of decades of the journey of the industry, and I remember back in 2005 what the continuous integration story was, and forget automated deployment. It was just a matter of, hey, we have lots of people working. How do we get all of their code merged into a buildable application? And there was lots of discussion because it was normal at the time for people to work on code and not even check it in, much less branching, but not even check it in for a couple days at a time. And so the integration part started out with, let's integrate the code from multiple people, much less dependencies and other systems.
Yeah, continuous integration, I think today is sort of seen more as like, do you have a build server that runs every time you commit code? Yeah. And that's important and that's part of it. But actually, continuous integration really started from, it kind of sucks when there are developers working on their own copies of the code. And this is like, imagine people have a file share and, they create a folder and they call it like Pete's version of the code and Mary's version of the code. And they work on it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then it's time to get it ready. And they're in for a lot of merge pain. And that was continuous integration, right? Just not doing that, working on really short-lived branches, merging the code. And then you get into this problem, well, Mary's committed her change and Pete gets it and he can't build it, and vice versa. So that's where the build server came in.
So for those not familiar, and you might have heard the name Octopus Deploy, but it's a pretty major player in the market. Paul, can you give us a rundown? You started it for a particular reason, and now it's a very significant product with tons and tons of customers, and there's people that use it with Azure DevOps services, but also other build servers and integrated therein. But what was your original vision when you said, hey, it's 2011, I think I'll start a company?
Yeah, it was that dashboard. So if you've seen a video of Octopus or a demo or played with it, we have this dashboard, and obviously this is a podcast, I can't show it, but imagine the listeners, close your eyes. Don't do that if you're driving. But imagine you've got running vertically down the screen, you've got a set of projects. So these are the things that you deploy, and then running across the screen are your environments, so dev, test, production. And what would happen is I'd be on these projects, and like I said, you'd spend 4 or 5 weeks trying to figure out how to deploy something and try to automate it. And then what you had the problem with is you'd written all this PowerShell or batch files or whatever it was, and no one had any visibility into that. So it was someone's job to run that thing, or to set it up to run from the build server, maybe to deploy to a dev environment so people could see what was going on. But these questions would get asked, like, what version of the software is in test? I'm a tester. I want to test some things. Am I testing the right version of the software? Or, a manager asking, has something been deployed to production? Or, the last time that was deployed, what happened versus this time? Because something's gone wrong this time. We want to go back and look at the logs. And so it was trying to create visibility into that. So, someone in QA can look at what's going on that dashboard and just really quickly understand 4.3 was deployed to test 4 hours ago, and just answer those questions immediately.
Yeah. For people who have already automated deployments and been living in that environment for a few years, I think it's easy to take it for granted. But for those listeners who are deploying their software manually, then it's another manual task to even record or document what version you just deployed to what environment and when you did it. Because it's not automatic. So it's another manual task.
Yeah, that's right. And it's being run by a person. And so the next challenge you have is what happens when that person's not around. They've taken a holiday, you need to do a deployment. In a lot of enterprises, it's one thing to say, okay, when Mary's away, Pete is going to do deployments. It's quite another for Pete to even get the permissions he needs to be able to deploy something, that access requests and so on can take a lot of time. So,
right. So this is the Azure DevOps Podcast, meaning we're all building and shipping software targeting Azure as our runtime environment, but we want to do it in a DevOpsy way and take advantage of everything that method and school of thought has to offer. So for those in here who are not yet using Octopus Deploy, just tell us where the sweet spot is, where it really fits in for Visual Studio developers, but they're running their stuff in Azure.
Yeah, so DevOps is a big thing, right? It's way beyond just deployment of stuff. It's all the things you do leading up to that. It's all the people, processes, and so on that go into it. It's how people think about. Developers never really used to think a lot about what it took to run their software in production, and I think that's something that's changed, especially with the cloud. And then it goes all the way through to like what's happened after you've deployed, so monitoring and so on. And Azure DevOps is obviously trying to do all of those things, right? Everything from bug tracking to source control to builds to deployments to monitoring. We focus on deployments, and so our goal is to just do that really, really well. It used to be that when back in those olden days we were talking about, you would get the code, and when it was time to deploy to production, you would, in your IDE, you would find the publish to FTP button, and you would click that, and that's how you would deploy things. And then when it was time to deploy to production, you'd do the same, but you would change the FTP address and so on. And that was like every IDE had to have that feature. That's changed now. I think, publishing a modern website, building modern systems, there are so many computer systems involved. You can't just FTP something to one location and do a deployment from your IDE that way. So the practices have moved on, and there are plenty of tools that focus on providing a really easy way to automate deployments for simple simpler applications. We've focused, I guess, on what happens after that. So those simple apps, they start off simple, and then over time, they grow, they get more parts. You start taking advantage of different cloud services that all have their own different ways of deploying. And you need some way that's going to pull all that together and handle stuff like database migrations and so on. So I think our sweet spot is those really complicated deployments, or those deployments that someday may become a really complicated deployment, and trying to make those really consistent so that engineers can kind of understand not only how this really complicated thing is deployed, but to see that it's deployed quite similarly to a lot of the other applications they work on, and so they can move between projects and have that knowledge follow them.
That's a good point of the push to FTP. Architecturally thinking, that's assuming that you have more of a monolithic system that you could push files to a place and deploy your system. And so that's two assumptions. One is that you mostly have a monolithic architecture. And the second is that from where you are, you have firewall access and you can open up a connection to that destination server and then push files. Whereas in today's world, there's fewer large monolithic applications being built, and those that are there are being chunked up into sub-applications and microservices. They're being split apart, and so there's more deployable targets. And so the new model is a pull-based model where there's a lot of the products, not just Octopus, but a lot have adopted the agent-based, where the target machines have an agent, and then they call out and say, hey, I'm ready to do stuff. Oh, you want me to deploy something? Okay, can I please have whatever it is to deploy? Thank you. And then, of course, it installs it on. So the direction of the network connection is reversed from source to destination. Now it's destination asking for the package from the source.
Yeah. We see, so we look at tools like Puppet or Chef, where so there's sort of, I guess, two approaches to doing deployments, right? There's this kind of desired state model where you say, and similar to like PowerShell DSC, where you say, here's the state of the world that I want the world to be in, and the system has to go and figure out how to do that. And then the alternative approach is kind of imagine a cooking recipe. Do step 1, do step 2, do step 3. In our experience, managing infrastructure, like I need all of my Windows servers to be running this patch and to have these folders with these permissions granted, a desired state model works really well. So you say, here's where I want the world to get to, and then over time that will kind of trickle out. Where that breaks down, I think, is around dependencies, especially dependencies across other systems. So things like we need to stop the application servers. We need to set the website to offline mode. We need to deploy some changes to our database, change the database schema. And then we need to bring the application servers back online. And then we need to bring the website back online. And in that order, right? If you do it out of that order, you're going to have a lot more downtime, and so that kind of desired state model doesn't work so well. So most deployment tools, including Octopus, tend to follow more of a procedural, I guess, do step 1, do step 2 in this order process.
Well, the desired state, it breaks down. It's guaranteed to break down because there's no way that any deployment procedure, an automated deployment script, can handle an infinite number of combinations of whatever the current state is at the target environment. You could say, oh, this is my desired state. Okay, but from what state? And so mathematically, there's an infinite number of combinations of from and to. And so maybe if you make some assumptions and constrain it down, that no, it's either in these 3 states, and from there we can go. That works, and it can work in simple cases. But I think the incremental procedural step where there's there's a set steps of migrations from your application components, whether it's database or whatnot, that actually has a mathematical proof component, and you can kind of squeeze it down to where it's almost guaranteed to work properly because you know exactly what you're starting with.
Yeah, that's true. And then you've got sort of, I guess, the hybrid of that, right? So you have this sort of procedural deployment, but you try and do things in somewhat of a idempotent way, so that, so for example, with Octopus, there are certain types of steps where if we've already deployed a particular package version to a particular machine, you can configure it to not not go and redo that because it's going to just cause stuff to go offline and come back online for no reason. So there's various like shortcuts that the desired state approach does quite well that you kind of wish the procedural kind of mode did. And most tools kind of end up trying to blend those a little bit as well. So with Octopus, I think we focus a lot more though on the high level goal of what you're trying to do. So even though it's procedural, it would be, I would need to run some database migrations and I need to deploy this web app. It kind of is at that level. I need to deploy this web app. It's not, I need to go into the web config file and then I need to add some settings here and change this value. And then I need to go into this step and that step. We try to kind of understand what people are trying to do, what problem they're trying to solve. I'm trying to deploy an ASP.NET app. And then we build a lot of features and convention into the product to make it really easy to configure that automation at that higher level. So if you look at like deploying a web app in Octopus, there's settings for, if you're deploying to IS, for example, for what kind of bindings you want, what port you're listening on. You can add multiple of those. All the settings around like what application pool the web application runs as. So it's not like step one, a 50-step process for deploying a web app. It's one step, and we take care of most of the grunt work, I guess.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how much depth the library has just to take advantage of literally any type of application component that needs to get deployed just with a few clicks.
Yeah, we're really proud. We passed 300 community contributed steps to our library. So if you haven't used Octopus, when you go to add a deployment step, things like deploying web apps and so on, we have about, I think it's probably a few dozen now, steps that we've provided and built in and support. And they range from everything from web apps to Windows services to integrations with things like Redgate's database tooling, and then all the way through to deploying Kubernetes clusters and Java applications, etc. And then we have this, but if you kind of keep scrolling down, you'll then see this like whole library of community contributed stuff. And essentially what people do is they'll figure out how to deploy something. So they'll work out like we've got a particular type of load balancer that most Octopus customers may not be using. So there's nothing built in for it. They'll work out what the PowerShell is to automate something like that. And then they can publish that to our library to share with everybody else that's using Octopus. And that's been like a wonderful community project.
Nice.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
We have some new features to get into. And I know you've made some announcements, but one question before we get into that. Out of all the build servers out there, which ones integrate the best with Octopus Deploy? Just drop in. I mean, you got Jenkins TeamCity, Azure DevOps, then you got the GitLab product that's coming out, and you got Travis CI, and you got build servers out the yin yang, right? So which ones are drop dead simple to integrate with Octopus Deploy?
I think so. On this podcast, I feel like I have to say Azure DevOps, but
well, there's lots of .NET developers using lots of stuff and running their systems in Azure, so it's a big ecosystem.
Yeah. And I think it's wonderful that Microsoft have embraced that. It used to be Azure or TFS. You had to use everything that came with TFS. Now it's certainly a lot easier to integrate other tools. So we publish plugins for 3 major build systems, or I guess. So there's a plugin for TeamCity, there's a plugin for Azure DevOps, and there's a plugin for Bamboo from Atlassian. And then we have community driven projects around Jenkins and some other build servers. I think those main 3 are probably the easiest ones. I think the TeamCity philosophy for how they do builds probably aligns with Octopus a bit better. And so I think that plugin is a bit easier to use. But that said, the Azure DevOps one kind of benefits from being able to be used both by the build side of Azure DevOps as well as the release side of it. So you can sort of use Octopus to replace release management in Azure DevOps, or you can use it to augment it and still have your release stages in Azure DevOps, but have them call out to Octopus to do the heavy lifting of the deployment.
Cool. All right, so there's a brand new release that's coming out, and it has kind of some new organization topics. Now, if for people not using Octopus, then no difference to them. But for people who are or have looked at Octopus, it could be a game changer here.
Yeah, so if you've used Octopus, you find that we have some philosophical differences, I guess, compared to other release management tools. And one is this idea that projects and environments kind of existed at the global level. So, in Azure DevOps, when you do release management, you'll have a release process. And as part of that, you'll say, here's the steps I want to do when I deploy to dev. And then here's the steps I want to do when I go to test. And here's the steps I want to do when I go to production. And those three environments belong to that release template. They're not sort of a global thing that exists outside of the project. And so when you go to your next project, you then define the next set of environment stages, which may happen to share the same name, but they're not really the same entity. With Octopus, we take a different approach. So your project has a deployment process, and in Octopus, you configure environments like dev, test, and prod. And that process should be the same across all of those environments. We think that's a really good practice to get into. There can be some exceptions, like we've got a particular step that only runs in production, but generally you have one process and it's the same and it's consistent across all the environments. And that's the same for every project you have. So you could have 3 or 4 projects and then all of them sharing the same dev, test, prod environment. It makes a lot of sense for microservices. It makes a lot of sense when you're deploying things to a data center on-prem where the machines might actually serve multiple applications. But it gets a bit messier, especially as you start doing more things in the cloud where we tend to have a separate resource group or something for every application we deploy. And so what Spaces does is it sort of allows you to carve up your Octopus service. So Spaces is this new feature. We've spent about 9 months working on this, working really closely with larger customers on it. And what it does is it allows you to say, for each team, here's a space that you can call your own. It's like, it's your bedroom, it can be as messy as you like, but it's yours. And then another team can have their space over here. And within that space, you can have environments and projects. Someone can be the administrator for that space, so they can grant other people access. They can choose who's allowed to deploy to production within that space, but without sort of needing global administrator privileges. We didn't have this feature at the start because Octopus has, I think in some ways, grown a lot bigger than I kind of ever expected it to, even within a single company. So, when we built it, I always thought of like a given team that I'm familiar with working with would have, 3 or 4 projects and 3 or 4 environments with a dozen or so machines in them. And we go around and like, that's how our customers started. So a customer would adopt Octopus, they would use it for, at that kind of a scale. And then other people would like it and they would start using it. And so we would go around and we would see these companies with hundreds of environments, hundreds of projects, thousands of machines that they're deploying software to. And we kept kind of doing performance work to make it better and faster and to keep up with that kind of scale. But the challenge was just, as far as the UI goes, it was really hard to understand. We had to scroll through big, long lists of things, essentially. And so that's where Spaces came from.
Yeah, and we've worked on some of those massive instances. It's crazy how especially companies with dozens and dozens of software systems, and each system, maybe chunked up into 3 or 4 deployable things, deployable components. That list can get pretty darn long. And if TeamCity has a way to segment the groupings of builds, and Azure DevOps Services has the project essentially grouping, and it has a different team structure. And so that really aligns, I think, with Spaces where each team could get a space. And instead of a team having their own Octopus Deploy installation, the company or major department could have their own Octopus Deploy implementation, and then a space provisioned for the team or for the software system. And then it gives some good structure there. Yeah,
that's exactly how we think it'll be used. A lot of the customers we talked with, they would get to a point where they would decide they were just going to set up a separate Octopus instance for each team, not because of performance issues or anything like that, but purely because just to help organize things better and to allow one person to be the administrator for that team's Octopus. And so this is just a way of bringing it into one service.
Yeah. And I've previewed it a little bit because we have it used on so many so many customers. And I think it's a really clean implementation. I'm excited for people to be able to download and try it out for themselves, because it's not this huge shift that says, okay, you're going to have to re-implement your Octopus Deploy. It really is and you slid that in pretty seamlessly, I think.
Yeah, I always joke that we spend 9 months working on one drop down at the top of the app. But if you can imagine, so the way it looks is you've got the navigation bar at the top of the app, like every app has. And along there, you've got your projects and environments and tenants and so on. So these are all the things that you generally would set up within Octopus. And to the left of all of that, you can now just choose your space. And so when you choose your space, it sort of filters everything. If you've used like in Azure, you'll have subscriptions. And if you've got multiple subscriptions, you can sort of go in and say, I just want to filter everything by a subscription. And it makes looking at your Azure or the list of stuff that you have in Azure so much easier to understand. Or if you filter it to a resource group, you can just see your app, and it just makes so much more sense. That's what Spaces is doing. It was 9 months because there was a lot of permission changes and other things that had to go on behind the scenes to make it work. Every table in the database gets a new column for what space it's in and so on. But at the end, the UI for it, there's not a lot to it. We try to make it simple.
So a question that I get a lot, but I want to know your answer for everyone out there is, Octopus Deploy has tentacles, and you put the tentacle agent on the different server environments. But now more and more, there's still tons of virtual servers out there, but more and more people are adopting serverless environments, whether it be Azure or AWS. There's nowhere for us to put a tentacle agent. And so for going serverless, I think that's a common question out there. Okay, where does the agent go? How is it configured? Because I'm just asking Azure to run my app.
Yeah, that's right. So Octopus kind of solved in the early days, especially for people who deployed everything to VMs, which I think is actually a lot more common than cloud vendors would want you to believe. People would deploy, and even within the cloud, we see heaps of customers still deploying to virtual machines. So if you're still doing that out there, don't feel bad about it. It is still a very common thing. So the agent solves this problem of how do we get the application onto that machine that it's running on? Because even in a serverless world, right, there's still something that's running that application. And how do we extract it, change the configuration files, all this sort of stuff that has to be done on that remote machine. So Tentacle, and the reason we call it Octopus is it has all these tentacles out there. The Tentacle agent solved that problem, but it doesn't make sense to use if you're deploying an Azure web app or an Azure function or something like that. But most cloud environments have their own tooling where we can give it a package and say, hey, go and deploy this version of the function or go and deploy this web app. And it takes care of, I guess, how do we get the bits onto the machine, and we just publish that. That said, there is still a bit of a gap, I guess, between your build and deployment server and getting the stuff to the Azure environment that it's running in. So because you may need different versions of the Azure SDK. If you're deploying if you're still deploying cloud services, for example, which Microsoft have deprecated and, they're not encouraging anyone to use, but people have built applications on them and they're still deploying them. They need a particular version of the SDK, and newer versions of the SDK, there's some issues with support and so on. And so you may still need a machine in the middle that's pushing those out. In Octopus, we call those workers. They still actually run our Tentacle agent. They tend to live a bit closer to the place where you're deploying stuff from, so closer to where the Octopus server is. But they give you that ability to say, I need a machine that's running Linux because it's going to use some command line tools, some Linux command line tools to deploy to something to Azure or to AWS. And then when I'm running this deployment process, I need it to run from a Windows machine with this version of the Azure SDK and some other dependencies set up on it. So that's kind of where the agent goes, I guess, a bit more closer to the deployment server.
In production, deployment is the beginning. Octopus Deploy is all about deploying. With the whole ecosystem from planning your project to doing development and then builds and deployments, and now you have it's running in Azure, where we need to figure out how to centralize our logs and get visibility into the environments and then do maintenance or environment changes on the target environments. What should people be looking at? Which tasks should go in Octopus Deploy, and where's that boundary?
So right now, I think we're really heavily focused on the deployment side of it. So anything to do with how you deploy, how do you get one release from another? So imagine that if you weren't automating things, but you were to write a Word document. Okay, it's the end of our 2-week sprint, and we may have made changes to all the different things that it takes this application to run. How would you document deploying something like that? And it would be this big Word document with 50 or 100 different steps of all the things that you need to do to make this application run. That kind of stuff should definitely live within Octopus. You can use Octopus for other things. So we'll often see people who set up a project with a deployment process that's actually used more as a maintenance thing. So within Octopus, so if you were doing something like, we need some way to take our application offline between certain hours, that's not really a deployment. It's just a change. Or we've changed some feature toggles, which are at the moment config file entries. So we need to just deploy that config file out or make those config file changes. You can still set those up as steps within a deployment process within Octopus and go and deploy that. And one of the beautiful things about that, if you imagine a team of operations folks or DevOps folks who are writing PowerShell scripts for managing the application once it's deployed, it's the same problem that we talked about before with deployments in the old days. If someone's running that, you can't go and find the output of it. You're not sure exactly which version they're running. Hopefully they're running the latest one and you've been committing that script to source control, but what if they're not? Putting that in Octopus means you can say, the same version of the scripts that I've been running in the test environment, I want to run that in production. I don't want to accidentally run, someone has edited this code for this script, and they've never actually tested it against a test environment. Now I'm about to run this in production as part of a disaster recovery process. That would be a bad thing to do. And so Octopus still gives you that ability to understand how these things have been run in the different environments, and to run them in a repeatable way where everyone gets that visibility into what's happened. Awesome.
So before we close out, I'd like to get your vision for the future. Now, the DevOps conversation is everywhere. Everyone wants to go fast, short cycle time. They want stable, quick deployments that don't fail, and they want the system to run stably in production. And so there's lots of things in flux. But where do you think that we're going to be, 5, 10 years down the road? And where do you see us heading? What do you think is going to become normal and taken for granted just down the line?
So I think that as time is going by, I think those kind of core needs around continuously delivering applications and having them ready to be deployed and then deploying them out, and to do that in a way that minimizes downtime, those are solved problems, and some teams are kind of hitting that goal. Some teams are still struggling with it. I think at the moment, not because of build and deployment tooling, but more because of the environments they're deploying into. So, if you're deploying something to Azure websites, for example, there are great features in there like staging slots and swapping that to production slots and so on, where you're able to minimize downtime, and it's not hard to automate something like that. It does get a bit harder when you start to just deploy to virtual machines, for example. A lot more of the onus on that. Octopus can't even help a lot with that. We've got a bunch of things that help a bit, but that last mile, I guess, sort of still comes down to you. So I think that part of it is feeling like a solved problem. I think the next part is, we don't sell Octopus as a DevOps tool. If you look through our website, you won't see any real mention of DevOps, because we do think DevOps is much bigger than just tools. And but it's a lot bigger than deployments too. So once an application is deployed, we're finding there's still a lot of automation type tasks, as we were just talking about. There's doing database backups, restoring, making sure those database backups actually do restore, taking applications offline temporarily, running various kind of things to recover an application, to re-provision the environment that it's on, and so on. All these kind of automation tasks that, when we were starting to automate deployments, our job was to replace that big Word document on how do you deploy this thing. But there are still Word documents on, within Octopus internally, when we train people to be on call for our cloud product, there are documents on what to do when a particular bad thing happens in the environment and scripts that they have to run when they do it. And Azure DevOps, Octopus, they don't do an amazing job at the moment of modeling those types of automation tasks. And for Octopus, that's something we want to try and solve. Outside of that tooling space, I think the real kind of question is what's happening to the places we're deploying stuff. So you've got kind of two camps forming, I think. There's sort of the cloud native camp that are taking advantage of all the various cloud services and kind of designing their projects around each of those services. So they've got an Azure function because it made sense for this piece of code, and they've got an Azure website for that piece of code, and they're really making use of all the different features the cloud has to offer. And then you've got the other team, which is, well, everything just lives in a container and we chuck it in Kubernetes and it just kind of floats around in there and everything is the same. We don't have functions and we don't have websites. And that seems, I think, to be driven a bit by who's kind of leading the infrastructure for projects and who's architecting them. So if you're looking across an estate of heaps of different projects that you've got to look after and manage and operate, Kubernetes is beautiful because everything goes in a container and you only have to learn that one thing. As long as you know how to manage containers, it's up to the application developers to figure out how to get stuff in containers and deploy them. Mm-hmm. And you just look after the cluster. Whereas, if you've got one team using Azure Functions over here, another doing an Azure website, some still doing things to virtual machines, and then another team that maybe was acquired recently or something are doing everything on AWS, it all just gets a hodgepodge of different things, but it's really optimized for the team. If you're a team and you're building something, even working with containers can be a bit of a hassle. Deploying something to an Azure website is just so easy. And so I think I'm not sure which of those things is going to win out. I think it'll be different in every organization. But I think that'll probably define where we go in the future too. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that vision casting.
One process element that I don't think that we as an industry have figured out is incident prevention and incident management. I mean, there's a lot of options for the build, a lot of options for deployment and all the steps and getting the environments where they need to be so that they're running. But now that they're running, there are various products out there to track incidents and knowledge base, like you mentioned, the Word document with what to do in certain situations. But I think as an industry, that gap isn't filled well by anyone, and it's certainly not integrated into any of the common tool chains. And so that's a process gap that we need to figure out somehow.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's a pretty good industry body of knowledge around like the concepts of runbooks and how to do on-call well and that sort of thing. I don't think there are great tooling solutions that give a lot of visibility into that. So, it's one thing to be on call and to have been trained how to run a particular script to recover an environment. It's certainly a lot more empowering, I think, if you can go and look at some kind of dashboard that shows you when that script was last run, what happened when it was last run. So if it hasn't worked for you this time, you can kind of see maybe the difference in the output of the logs and so on. So that's something that we'd like to try and solve. I think Octopus is sort of uniquely positioned to solve this because we've got that understanding of a production environment outside of the deployment process. It's sort of that global view that we talked about before. We know production is there. We know the machines and the cloud services that make up that environment. And so we can set up other processes essentially to be able to go and say, hey, I need to take the production database and, create a backup of that, mask it, and deploy it to test. And that's a 4-step process that you can model within Octopus. It's not a deployment, but it is some kind of automation process.
Yeah, hey, good points. Before we close out and go, what should our listeners follow up on to learn more about Octopus Deploy and the other stuff that we've spoken about today?
So if you use Octopus Deploy, we'd love you to join our Slack chat and to sort of be able to share the things you're doing with the rest of the community. So we have a Slack channel. You can find it if you go to our blog, octopus.com/blog. There's a link to join the Slack channel there. We'd love to see you there, and just to we find we have a lot of customers, and we don't, unfortunately, it's not the kind of business, I guess, where you have to talk to a salesperson as part of buying the product. It's really, you come to the website, download the trial if you like it. It's all there. But the downside to that is we don't get to meet all of our customers as much as we'd like. So we'd love people to join that chat if they are using Octopus. If you're not, obviously our website would be a great place to learn a bit more about it and what we do that's different. Awesome.
Well, hey, thanks so much, Paul, for visiting with me. This was fun.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.